Thanks very much, James, and appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come out here and speak about the role of a transfer agent in the going public process, but also on an ongoing basis as well. My name's Simon Thomas. I'm VP of Business Development for Computershare Canada. A little bit about Computershare. We've been in the registry business since 1978, publicly listed company ourselves. We operate in 20 countries. We have 5 offices in Canada, and we maintain accounts for over 125 million security holders worldwide. So a lot of experience within our organisation as it relates to the role I'm going to talk to you about. So, what is a transfer agent and registrar? I think everyone knows what a lawyer is. Everyone knows, what an auditor and what an accounting firm does. Some of you may not be familiar with the role of a transfer agent and registrar, so I want to touch on that briefly before I move into sort of our role in the going public process. You'll see the big block in there, or the big blob in the middle there, is really our core function as transfer agent as registrar. We are the official record keeper for all of your share and shareholder related records. So anyone who, we maintain your issued share capital, we maintain your central securities register, which basically means we're the gatekeeper for any of your registered shareholder needs. If they want to transfer their securities, if they want to move their securities underneath their brokerage account, they need to come through their transfer agent to make sure that the transaction they're requesting is properly validated, and any registrations are in proper legal form, and the central securities register can be updated so that we've always got an accurate reflection of who the shareholders are, who the registered shareholders are, of the issuer. All of those things are important. All of those roles up there on the circles on the outside form part of the role of a transfer agent and registrar. There's a couple I want to touch on in a little bit more detail, just because I think they're important in the early stages, attached to sort of the public side of things. Proof of ownership. Proof of ownership relates to the issuing of a share certificate or a statement of ownership in the company. So obviously a very, very important part. Shareholders purchase shares in the company, whether it's through an IPO or whether they get issued to them as a result of an RTO that James talked about initially. And the transfer agent and registrar is responsible for issuing them that proof of ownership. Very, very important for most shareholders. Transfer processing. Most transfer agents in Canada are a part of an organisation called STAC, the Stock Transfer Association of Canada. And as transfer agent, we are the gatekeeper. If a registered shareholder wants to transfer their securities to a third party, if they want to move them into their brokerage account, they have to come through the transfer agent in order to do that. We make sure the proper endorsement and guarantees that are required under industry standards are there. We make sure the registrations are correct. And again, as most importantly, we update the Central Securities Register and keep a record of all of those transactions for future audit purposes if they're required. Depository link. I won't get into this too much, but there's 2 types of shareholders in Canada: registered shareholders that are maintained on the Central Securities Register, and beneficial shareholders, who are basically shareholders who have their shares held by their broker. The depository link is a very, very important piece to a transfer agency role, because really what it allows is movements in between registered positions and beneficial positions. So companies issue shares, perhaps they register them to an individual. That individual then wants to move those shares into their brokerage account. So that link between the depository and the transfer agents is very, very important for efficient movement of securities. And again, most transfer agents in Canada are linked to the depository through electronic means, not all of them. And there's some real benefits to that electronic link that's available. One more I want to touch on here is the annual shareholders meeting, but in conjunction with that, I'll talk about sort of the shareholder communication side of things. For most companies, the annual shareholder meeting is the most high-profile time of the year as it relates to communication with your shareholders. an environment not dissimilar to this, where management gets up and talks about the performance of the company and addresses questions, sometimes difficult ones, and basically reports on the items that were being voted on, the election of directors, appointment of auditors, and things along those lines. Very, very important process. Very important process from a governance standpoint, because it's the one time in the year your shareholders get to tell you how you're doing as a company and as a management group. Transfer agents basically run your AGM process for you. More often than not, we facilitate the mailing and the communication that goes out to investors, making sure that you're meeting the necessary regulatory timelines. We mail out to the shareholders, we let them know they have their right to vote, we provide them with the necessary voting documentation, and most importantly, we receive all of those votes back, and we tabulate them independently on behalf of our issuer clients, and we report them to all shareholders at the meeting. Very, very important role. It really is a very important role, because you don't want to be. I've been to many, many disorganised annual shareholder meetings, and it does not reflect well on the company. So it's always good to have sort of an experienced group by your side, making sure that things run smoothly. Going public, transfer agents in the IPO process. I think it's fair to say that from pre-launch all the way through to post-offering, the transfer agent's role is they're an integral part of the team. They work alongside the issuer. They work closely with legal counsel in order to make sure that everything is ready to go, on the date of the IPO, or whether if it's an RTO type transaction. That we're ready to go, and we have all the documentation in place, we have all of the back-end structure in place to accurately and efficiently sort of issue the shares. We come into play a little bit later, I think, than the lawyers, obviously. Once all of the legal documentation, the business plans, all of that type of thing is put forward, and they have made a decision to move forward with it, that's when there's a transfer agent appointed. Pre-planning. We make sure that the timeline is practical, from getting your security set up on the system and making sure all the back end is ready to go. We provide documentation checklist, making sure the appointment of a transfer agent is effective, and any other documentation that's required in order to sort of move forward with the issuance of shares are in place in plenty of time to get the shares issued upon the closing. Regulatory compliance, making sure that any sort of exchange or other regulatory requirements are properly put in place. We provide specimen share certificates for pre-approval by whoever is required to approve them, whether it's the exchanges or other groups. And again, we make sure that the proper depository link is set up. So the Canadian Depository for Securities, we make sure there's a link set up there so that when times come to issue the shares, we can issue the shares electronically directly into the broker's account if that's what they want to do, or we can issue the shares to registered shareholders, and the depository will be ready to receive them manually through depositing in different means. The setting up of the securities. There's two types of proof of ownership that I touched upon before. One is a traditional share certificate. The other one is what is referred to as a direct registration statement, typically a bank statement, piece of paper. We make sure all of those are set up. We have, as a transfer agent, you're responsible for issuing those share certificates, important documents signed by your transfer agent, and records kept on the Central Securities Register for all of those. We also make sure we get any other issues that might be part of the share makeup of the company issued as well and maintained as well. So often units are issued, so shares attached to warrants are issued. So the transfer agent will more often than not take care of the register and all of your warrant holders, and they will be able to work with the warrant holders in the future to convert those warrant securities into shares if that's what they want to do. And last but not least, we work to set up any sort of necessary escrow agreements. So the administration of escrowed shares, typically, especially with sort of an IPO type arrangement, is very, very important, whether or not they're exchange mandated or otherwise. Managing the shares that need to be held in escrow is a very important role for a transfer agent and registrar. The closing. It's all all going well, everything's ready to go, the money's in, all the shareholder documentation is signed, and the last thing that needs to be done is the shares actually need to be issued. So the shareholders have paid their money, or they've voted in favour of a takeover, a reverse takeover that we talked about before, and it is the transfer agent's role to actually formally issue those shares and provide them with a proof of ownership. Depending on the method of the closing, they'll either be issued a share certificate, a direct registration statement, or the shares can be automatically electronically deposited to the various brokers through the depository link that I've touched upon a couple of times. And again, there's some real advantages to that electronic link. It removes a lot of costs associated with mailing of securities around, around the world sometimes, and it also, speeds up the process of reconciliation with the brokers as well, where we can move them directly into an electronic depository position. Shareholder communications. Part of any share issuance, especially attached to an IPO, is an introductory letter or welcome letter that lets, whether it's from the company or whether that's from Computershare or the transfer agent, and it really lets the investors know who they can contact if they have any issues surrounding lost share certificates, or they want to transfer their securities, or they want to ask any other questions in relation to their shares of the company. Obviously, most companies will have some kind of investor relations representative. They don't really deal with the mechanics of the ownership of the shares. All of that needs to be handled by the transfer agent. So we take tens of thousands of calls every day, thousands of calls in Canada alone from investors asking all sorts of questions regarding lost securities, transfer of securities. Do I have securities in this company? I would like to change my address. I want to transfer my shares to my daughter, to my son. And all of those queries are handled by a transfer agent. Post-launch, I touched upon our role as registrar. I touched upon our role as offering a transfer point for investors to come to, as the gatekeeper role. I talked about the AGM role. But I think most importantly, what I want to stress to you is when you are appointing a transfer agent in the going public process, it is important to appoint one who knows what they're doing. It's more than a simple record keeper role. There's rules, there's regulations around security issuances in Canada and globally. And if shares are not issued correctly, if there's not a proper audit trail kept, the company through management or through somebody else is inevitably going to have to deal with an angry shareholder whose shares have not been properly issued or have not perhaps been transferred incorrectly, and that's really going to take your eye off the ball of running your business. And that's the type of thing you want to avoid if possible, because that type of role resides, with groups like Computershare, who are experts in making sure that these things happen properly, so that there's no issues, and you can focus on what you guys are good at, which is running your companies. The last thing I wanted to speak about is the direct registration system. And what that initiative is referred to in Canada is the dematerialisation of securities. So we're working towards eliminating share certificates. We all, are familiar with the traditional share ownership, where you have a share certificate with the Mickey Mouse logo if you're a Disney shareholder, and you stick it on a wall in a frame, and that's fantastic and it looks great up on the wall. Not such a good approach if your house gets robbed and the security gets sold, or you have a flood and your security certificate gets destroyed. There's a number of risks attached to having a physical a share certificate, and this is where the dematerialisation of securities and this direct registration system and a direct registration statement is coming along in leaps and bounds as far as replacing traditional share certificates. So direct registrations, it's a system that allows for securities to be held in book entry electronic format. So instead of getting a share certificate, your shares are held electronically on the Central Securities Register, and you receive a piece of paper similar to a bank statement that explains or outlines your ownership in that company. If it gets lost, if it gets shredded, if it gets used as a placemat, it is as simple as going to a printer and printing out another one to get it replaced. So the reduced costs and risks associated with moving from a share certificate environment to a direct registration statement environment cannot be stressed enough. The rights and privileges are exactly the same whether you own a share certificate or a direct registration statement, but it really does. Having a direct registration statement eliminates the need to safeguard that security. Most people who are smart enough to realise the value of them will have them in a secure filing cabinet or a safe. It eliminates the additional costs of mailing those securities. So whenever Computershare mails out a share certificate, it needs to be done via registered mail or insured mail to make sure it's going to get there in time. And whenever a shareholder mails a security to us for transfer or for a deposit to their broker, that always should be done by secured mail, because I'm not sure what other people's experience with Canada Post is, but things sometimes get lost. And if your share certificate gets lost, we cannot replace it, or transfer agents across Canada cannot place it without the shareholder putting in place a surety bond or purchasing a surety bond. And the cost of those surety bonds can be anywhere between sort of 3 to 5% is a ballpark figure. So you can imagine if you have a share certificate worth, $250,000 or more, or even less than that, there is a pretty significant cost and an unnecessary cost given the direct registration system that's now in place. The other thing I wanted to just show you briefly is the chart at the bottom of the screen here. So you can see in red the old banknote securities certificates. That's what I was talking about, the Disney logo, the Mickey Mouse logo. They've obviously almost non-existent now. In Canada, we've moved into an environment whereby we have what's called a generic or a quick certificate. That is a sort of a template with a company name and sometimes a logo on there that can be easily replaced and easily changed if there's a name change with the company, if there's a change to the logo, without the additional costs of going to the banknote company and having to print another 10,000 certificates for when they may or may not get used. So the blue certificates is our regular certificates that we use now. The green at the top there is the direct registration statements. So you can see that more and more there is a trend whereby we're issuing less and less certificates at Computershare, and we're issuing more and more DRS statements. There's initiatives being put in place not only by us but by other organisations in Canada to further promote this dematerialisation of securities. At Computershare, we default to issuing direct registration statements for any new securities or shares that are issued, even attached to sort of transfers. And the only time a shareholder can get a certificate is if they specifically actually request, I would like to have a share certificate. And again, we're seeing less and less of that in our office. So that's all from me. Again, I'll be over there if there's any questions related to the role of a transfer agent, but thank you very much.